Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this morning's webinar, where we're going to be discussing the AUASB's consultation paper on agreed upon procedures engagements. The consultation paper that we're talking about today is based on the recently issued IAASB's exposure draft on AUPs. My name is Matthew Zapula. I'm the Technical Director of the AUASB, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. This morning's webinar will be hosted by one of our senior project managers, Renee Herman, who's our subject matter expert on AUP matters. But before we get into Renee's presentation, just a few housekeeping matters or matters around how we run the podcast. The first thing to note is this is the first, podcast. It's webcast, not podcast. This is the first time the AUASB is running a webcast of this nature. We've previously run some webcasts in conjunction with the New Zealand Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, but this is the first time we're doing it on our own. We've tested the technology. We hope it all works well, and hopefully you can all hear us all clearly and that the technology works. We'll cross our fingers. And look, when you would have seen all of your login details, and on the screen you'll see that the webinar looks like it's coming from the Australian Accounting Standards Board. That's because we share the account that we use with the AASB. I assure you we're not going to be talking about any boring accounting matters or speaking of the evils of special purpose reporting or anything like that. We're going to be strictly following auditing matters and dealing with AUPs today. So don't get spooked by the fact that it says AASB on your screen. Now, the webinar is going to go through a bit of background on the project from the IAASB's perspective, and also the history of this standard from the point of view of the AUASB. We're going to talk through the AUASB's process in relation to the feedback and the way we feed back to the IAASB and how you have an opportunity to be part of that feedback. Renee is going to take you through the main changes between the extant international standard and the international exposure draft. And then we're going to go through the key differences between the exposure draft and the current Australian standard. In many ways, the Australian standard's been ahead of the game on the international for some time, and Renee will talk you through how many of the changes that have been implemented in the international standard are ones that already are in the extant Australian standard. But of course, because we now need to go forward merging everything together, sometimes there's a little bit of ambiguity around the differences between the international and the Australian or the current Australian. So Renee will take you through that in a bit more detail. The aim of the webinar is to equip all of you listening with all the information you need so that you can understand the consultation paper that we put out and where you feel it's warranted, the ability to respond to any queries that you may have, and then hopefully feed into any responses that you have in relation to the consultation paper that we published just before Christmas. A bit of assumed knowledge that we have. When we put together the webinar, we've assumed that everyone has a basic level of knowledge on the Australian standard. It's been around for a number of years now, so the webinar has been put together on that basis. So if you're brand new to AUP engagements, there may be a little bit of assumed knowledge. If there are concepts which Renee's talking about which are challenging or you think need explanation, please submit a question and we can deal with those when necessary. Talking about questions, you'll see that there's a questions panel in the control panel of the GoToWebinar system. So if you submit your questions on there, then at the end of Renee's webinar presentation, we'll go through the questions, and I will be curating those on behalf of everybody. So please submit your questions. We may not get to all the questions depending on time. We're budgeted for 15 minutes of questions at the end, but please submit your questions and we'll look to see what questions are coming through, and where we have consistent themes coming through the questions, we'll then submit those to Renee to respond. So if you have any problems on the way through, if you think there's a major problem, please submit a question as well, and we can deal with that around how the webinar runs. But so far, so good. I'm now going to hand over to Renee to take you through the detail. Thanks, Renee.
Good morning, everyone. Let's start by summarising where the IAASB is at in the process of revising the standard on related services. Agreed upon procedures engagements, and I'll probably refer to them as AUP engagements through this webinar, they're widely used and the demand for them continues to grow, particularly in relation to the need for increased accountability around funding and grants. The extant international standard was developed more than 20 years ago, and it certainly has not kept up with the changes that have occurred in business environments that drive the demand for such engagements on both a financial and a non-financial subject matter. So to explore the issues related to AUP engagements, the IAASB commenced a project way back in 2015. In November 2016, a discussion paper was issued by the IAASB to explore the demand for and issues relating to AUP engagements. In September 2017, for public consultation and how this fits into the IAASB's process for the development of the final standard. Consulting on the IAASB's exposure draft, and we issued a consultation paper that is open to stakeholders for a 65-day comment period that will close on the 18th of February. This time frame will allow you all to have the time to respond to us on the questions that we raised in that consultation document, and it will allow time for the AUASB to conduct further outreach and then to collaborate all of our feedback into a submission that is due to the IAASB on the 15th of March. So what's really important is that now is the time that we can influence the development of the final standard, because it's now that the IAASB will respond to feedback that they receive. Remember that the AUASB's mandate is to adopt an international standard and only make amendments where there are compelling reasons to do so. So it's actually really important for us to receive your feedback so that the revised international standard will work for us here in Australia. So as I've previously mentioned, the international standard on AUPs hasn't been revised in more than 20 years. The corresponding Australian standard has been. In fact, the last Australian revision was as recent as July 2013. So what's actually happened from an Australian perspective is that this international exposure draft has largely caught the international standard up to where the Australian standard currently is. So many of the aspects contained in the international exposure draft are actually already included in the extant Australian standard. So for the most part, what we're now seeing is that the international exposure draft aligns with the Australian standard, but there are still a few points of difference, and we'll address that this morning. So let's first talk through the international revisions that either largely align with where the Australian standard currently sits, or where the amendments don't raise immediate alarm bells for me, because it's either just more practical or it's in line with current Australian practice. And this is really largely across 5 areas. The extant international standard is directed towards engagements regarding financial information. Stakeholders requested that the IAASB broaden the scope to include non-financial subject matters. The Australian standard is not limited to procedures regarding financial information. So an example of non-financial matter may be controls to meet contractual obligations. So with the changes in the proposed exposure draft, there will be clear alignment between the international standard and where the Australian standard currently sits. Looking at engagement, acceptance and continuance. The extant international standard sets out requirements and guidance that deal with the terms of the engagement, but it does not contain any requirements or application material on the conditions that are required to be met before the practitioner can accept an AUP engagement. The exposure draft now includes new requirements and application material that will address such preconditions for acceptance and continuance. These pre-acceptance conditions are already considered by the Australian standard. Where there is a difference between the exposure draft and the Australian standard is in relation to understanding the needs of intended users. The exposure draft requires that before accepting an AUP engagement, the engaging party acknowledges that the expected procedures will be appropriate. But there is no requirement for the practitioner to receive such acknowledgement from the intended users. The Australian standard requires that the needs and objectives of the intended users are considered and understood by the practitioner, and that agreement is obtained from these intended users as to the adequacy of the procedures. The IAASB considered whether to extend the engaging parties' acknowledgement to cover acknowledgement that the procedures are appropriate for intended users, but they actually decided not to do so, as it just might not be practical for the engaging party. So I don't expect that this difference should cause any issues in the Australian market, and in fact might be a more practical outcome. But we are happy to receive your feedback to the contrary, or where you think this might pose an issue. In relation to using the work of experts, the extant international standard did not deal with this area at all. So in our example that I used earlier about non-financial subject matters, the practitioner might need to use the work of a practitioner's expert to understand the legal terms of a contractual obligation. While the Australian standard already contemplates this under the topic of using the work of others, the exposure draft is more expansive in this area in that it provides more examples. So I expect that Australian stakeholders will find this additional application material and examples helpful. And I won't be expecting any change in practice in Australia as a result of the exposure draft. But again, I'm happy to receive feedback that tells us otherwise. A matter that regularly comes up when discussing AUP engagements is in relation to recommendations arising from the performance of these engagements. The extant international standard and the Australian standard doesn't contemplate the practitioner recommending changes or improvements on matters that arise from the performance of an AUP engagement. Responses to the IAASB's discussion paper and what we know in Australia indicate that practitioners may be requested to make recommendations together with an AUP engagement. For example, regulators might request recommendations on improving controls relating to deficiencies that are identified in an AUP report. So to better meet users' needs, the exposure draft requires the AUP report to be clearly distinguished from other engagement reports, such as recommendations. And then there's application material on how these recommendations can be distinguished from the AUP report. So Australian stakeholders may well find this addition helpful. And again, we'd love to hear from you in relation to the area of recommendations. Documentation is always a critical area of any engagement file. The extant international standard does not contain requirements in application material on documentation. The exposure draft addresses this gap with an outcome that's largely consistent with what's in the Australian standard now. So again, we're not expecting any change in practice in this area. So that's the summary of the 5 areas of change that I'm not expecting to understand is causing any issues or concerns for Australian stakeholders. Now on to the 3 areas where the international exposure draft isn't directly or neatly aligned to the Australian standard. Professional judgment, objectivity and independence, and report restrictions are the areas that I really want to talk through. Let's start with the topic of professional judgment. One of the differentiating factors between an AUP engagement and an assurance engagement is the extent of the practitioner's professional judgment exercised in selecting and conducting procedures. An AUP engagement involves performing specific procedures that have been agreed with the engaging party. In an AUP engagement, professional judgment may be exercised in assisting the engaging party to identify the procedures when agreeing the terms of the engagement, but it's only the professional competency and skill of the practitioner that's exercised when conducting the procedures. So examples of applying professional judgment in an AUP engagement would be in discussing the procedures, in describing the findings, in determining the resources, in deciding what appropriate terminology is. In contrast, in an assurance engagement, professional judgment is exercised in selecting and conducting the procedures, where the practitioner is exercising their professional judgment to determine the procedures necessary to gather sufficient appropriate evidence on which to base a conclusion, which provides assurance to the intended user. One of the most significant attributes of an AUP engagement is the lack of subjectivity in both the procedures and the factual findings. Applying judgment requires a level of subjectivity. So the AUASB in the extant standard considers that it is not appropriate for the practitioner to exercise professional judgment when conducting the AUP procedures. The proposed international standard does contain similar requirements and guidance to that of the Australian standard, but it uses different wording and language, and it'll be found across multiple paragraphs in the requirements and the application material to get to the same result as the extant Australian standard. The exposure draft is just not as direct in the wording as is in the Australian standard. So we'd like to get your feedback in relation to the role of professional judgment in an AUP engagement and whether the proposed international standard appropriately reflects the role that professional judgment has in an AUP engagement, and whether the proposed standard is clear enough in this regard. So Matthew's going to run a quick poll and he's going to take you through that to gauge your immediate views.
Thanks, Renee. So everybody, you should now see on your screen a quick poll with 3 options. So the question is, does the international exposure draft appropriately reflect the role of professional judgment, and is the wording clear? Now, many of you may not have had a chance to read the consultation paper yet, so you don't have to answer. I'll give you just 30 seconds more. Okay, we'll close the poll now. And interestingly, Renee, quite a variation of the responses. So I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm not surprised actually by the variation of responses, so that'll be an interesting one for us to work through. Okay, second tab of the rank is independence and objectivity. The APES Board's Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants requires practitioners to comply with fundamental principles, including objectivity. The principle of objectivity requires practitioners not to compromise their professional or business judgment because of bias, conflict of interest, or the undue influence of others. The Code of Ethics does not, however, require a practitioner performing non-assurance engagements, such as an AUP engagement, to be independent. For this reason, as well as in response to feedback on the IAASB's discussion paper, the proposed standard does not make independence a precondition for the practitioner. Rather, for transparency reasons, the proposed standard requires the AUP report to include statements addressing when the practitioner is or is not required to be independent and whether the practitioner is or is not independent. The Australian standard differs to the exposure draft in that the Australian standard has an independence requirement for the practitioner equivalent to the independence requirements applicable to other assurance engagements, unless the engaging party has explicitly agreed to modified independence requirements. If modified independence is agreed, then the level of independence applied is described in the AUP report. So we'd like to obtain your feedback in relation to whether or not the practitioner should be required to have a level of independence when performing an AUP engagement. Again, Matthew will run our second poll of the morning to see where your current thinking lies.
Thanks, Renee. So the second poll question is, should a practitioner be required to have a level of independence when conducting an AUP engagement? So please respond. This one's a bit more straightforward, so I won't put as much time on this question. And while you're answering, I'll just make a note that we don't have lots of questions coming through. Please feel free to submit your questions through GoToWebinar. And also, a couple of people have contacted us to say that Renee's been dropping out every now and then. Unfortunately, that's something to do with our internet connection here at the AUASB. So hopefully it's not too bad for everybody. It seems to have died down now. Okay, we'll close the poll. And Renee, you'll see most people do believe a level of independence should be required.
So that's interesting. Not surprising, interesting, and it's areas like this that we'll really need to consider when the exposure draft develops by the IAASB and the standard lands from the IAASB. And it's areas like this where the AUASB will consider things like compelling reason amendments potentially. So it'll play out in due course. The last difference that I want to cover today is regarding AUP report restrictions. So the AUASB, when they revised AUP standard, made a very clear distinction between the use of an AUP report and the distribution of such a report. And the distinction is deliberately included in the requirements of the standard. And the purpose of the distinction isn't to prevent the distribution of the report per se, but to deter the use of the report by those other than the intended users. Reliance on the AUP report is effectively restricted to the intended users identified, even if the report is distributed to other parties. So the Australian standard requires a restriction on use paragraph to be included in an AUP report. The proposed international standard does not restrict the AUP report to parties that have agreed to procedures to be performed. However, the report is required to state the purpose of the report and that the report might not be suitable for any other purpose. Where this difference in relation to restriction of report becomes important is in relation to modified independence. Modified independence rules are only applicable or allowed where the report includes a restriction on use paragraph. So if there's no restriction on use paragraph, there can't be modified independence. So Australian stakeholders that support the current Australian independence requirements, and from the result of the last poll, sounds like that's the case, they would also need to support a restriction on use paragraph, as is required in the extant Australian standard. So we'd like to understand whether you agree with the proposals of the proposed standard that the report should not be restricted to parties that have agreed to the procedures to be performed. So the last poll of the morning, Matthew, can expect some initial views on that.
Sorry, Renee, just one or two technical difficulties here. But we should be able to launch the poll now. There we go. Thank you, everyone. So the final question is, should an AUP report be restricted and contain a restriction of use paragraph? Okay, thanks everyone. We've got 2/3 of the people who voted now, which is great. So I'll close the poll. And the results for that one are that the majority of people certainly think that there should be a restriction of use paragraph. Okay, I'll hand back to you, Renee.
Terrific. Thanks, Matthew. So, where to from here? The AUASB's consultation paper, as I said earlier, will close on the 18th of February, and we really need your responses to the matters covered in today's webinar to understand whether you agree with the international exposure draft, whether the areas in the Australian standard that should continue to be supported. And we've already heard or got a bit of a representation from the polls in terms of independence and restriction on use. And that'll give the technical team, it'll give us time to analyse the feedback that we receive. We'll then prepare a draft submission for discussion at the 6th of March's AUASB meeting. So the board will discuss the draft submission at that meeting. And the technical team will then turn this around to meet the IAASB submission deadline of the 15th of March. So we are going to open up. Matthew's been looking at some of those for now, so let's understand where things are at.
Yep, thanks, Renee. Before we do that, we might just quickly go back to the, can you just go forward a slide? Because we're currently still seeing the judgment independence slide. So if you can move to the next slide, which is the where to from here, please.
Okay, give us a sec. Yep.
Okay, I can't see it. Can you see on your screen, Renee?
Sorry, I missed the question. What are we
So
looking
can
for?
you, there we go. That's what. Okay, the where to from here slide. So Renee went through this. I spoke to these points, everybody, but unfortunately the slide hadn't progressed. So we just might reiterate what's on this. On this slide about the timing of the consultation paper, and it feeds into the one of the first questions that has come through, and the question was, what's the AUASB's view on the 3 poll questions that Renee's asked, or that we've asked today? I'll be very clear with everybody that when it comes to the AUASB's view, whilst individual AUASB members will no doubt have particular views, as a collective, the AUASB hasn't come to a view yet, and the consultation process, the consultation paper that Renee's been describing to you today, is really designed to assist the AUASB get to that point. So I don't want to preempt what the outcome will be. The AUASB will, as Renee alluded to, based on the discussions held through the various stakeholder engagement we do, the feedback we get on the webinar today, the submissions that are received, then the AUASB will form a view based on that. Obviously, from our perspective, obviously with an existing AUP standard in place, which addresses a number of the issues already raised in the international, the starting point for us will be, or starting point for our board members will be, if there is a difference between what's being proposed internationally and what's already current practice in Australia, we'll be asking the question of, well, what is the right way to go? Should we be adopting the international requirements, or should we be consistent with what's currently in place in Australia? This is one of those standards where genuinely there is a choice, and we'll be, as an AUASB board, they will be debating that particular point. So again, the need to, or the desire for you to have your say and submit by the 18th would be welcomed, and you genuinely do have an opportunity to influence the discussion and debate on this. Okay, we've got a couple other questions, Renee. One of them's straightforward, and I can answer that. It's in relation to the webinar itself, and will the webinar be recorded and available to attendees afterwards, or other attendees who couldn't attend today? The answer to that's definitely yes. Whilst we're still novices when it comes to the technology, we certainly are looking to utilise these webinar formats going forward. A good opportunity for everyone to get consistent messages. So we will definitely be making the recording available. We haven't actually formalised how we do that using the technology because it's still early days for us, but we will certainly make sure that happens. And when we do that, we will put a notice on the AUASB website with the necessary links, etc. Okay, Renee, a question for you that's come from one of the participants is why didn't the International Board just basically take the Australian wording, particularly when it's been operating very successfully in Australia for a number of years?
Thank you, Matthew. Gee, that's an interesting question in itself. So thank you to whoever asked that question. Our board really asked the same question. We had given to the IAASB, and they had full access to the Australian standard. At a point in time, we did have staff on the agreed upon procedures working group working with the international working group on the subject matter. The AUASB has, throughout the process of the development of the standard, given the IAASB our feedback, excerpts from our standard, our views of where our standard currently is at and why it's at that point in time. But at the end of the day, the IAASB working group is, there's a lot of people from a lot of different countries with a lot of different views. And I guess that's the point of the exposure draft, is that they really are asking some of these pertinent questions. Have they got it right in some of the instances? So while we in Australia have given our feedback, they really need to hear from the rest of the world as well as to whether the rest of the world is on board with where the AUASB standard currently is at. And I guess once they get that feedback to the exposure draft, we might see even greater alignment again in these three areas. So why didn't they just take the Australian standard? They want to take and need to take a public interest world view when they're setting standards.
And I've actually had one or two other people comment through the questions, Renee, querying, did the actual International Board review the Australian standard as part of the deliberation process when they were coming up to the exposure draft? Well, I think the answer is definitely yes, but we're not sure about the extent to which it was covered. Are you able to shed any light on that point?
Well, they definitely had the Australian standard, and as I said, we did at a point in time have some staff members on the working group. So from an international perspective, they certainly had the Australian standard. They certainly understood some of the Australian views and positions at the time. So they did have full access to the Australian standard, and would have read the full Australian standard.
And certainly privately, a number of board members we know, were very supportive of elements in the Australian standard, and as part of the public debate that happened at the IAASB meetings, that point did come up on a regular basis. So I think we can safely say, as Renee alluded to, that the Australian standard did get a fair airing, but the various broader opinions around the globe meant that there was differences that needed to be applied, and it wasn't appropriate from an international point of view to just take the Australian standard verbatim. Okay, we don't have any other technical questions coming through. Unless just one come through. Okay. If you just bear with me, I'll just quickly, there's a quick questions come through in respect of some of the logistics of the webinar. The question was, can you see all of the other questions put by the various participants? And the answer to that is unfortunately no. The webinar program is set up so that I can see all the questions as the moderator. I can share with you, however, that I've covered all of them. So rest assured, there's nobody asking questions that I haven't got to yet, except one that's just come in just now. And the question is, why do we have a choice, Renee, as to whether to adopt any revised international standard on AUP? Is this different to an ISA? And I think that question is alluding to the fact that this being a different standard to a typical auditing standard, an ISA and ASA, does the Australian Auditing Standards Board's mandate that comes from the ASIC Act and the FRC directive extend to AUPs as well as ISAs? It's a good question to clarify, so I might throw that one to you, Renee.
That's fine, thanks. I believe that the mandate would cover all of our pronouncements, really. So unless there are compelling reasons not to adopt an international standard, the AUASB's mandate is to adopt an international standard. So that would cover off on this standard on related service engagements as well. And that's where we come into the true compelling reason test. And where there are principles and practices in Australia
Renee, I'll have to jump in there because we've got quite a lot of people saying that you've dropped out, so I don't know if you can hear me. So, yeah, we might have to just stop. So everyone can hear me, okay? All right, so Renee, how about you come across to my room? That might be the better option. I think we can do that. For those of you online, Renee are in different offices. Get Renee to come across to my room, please. So we're operating on the fly here. If you ever noticed. Okay, I'd like to welcome Renee to the room. This is where the magic happens. And cozy. If you can shut the door, Renee. Okay. All right, Renee, if you can talk.
Oh, am I going through that question again?
Yeah, we'll need to go through that question again, please. So this is in respect of the question of whether or not the mandate for international applies to AUPs as much as it does to other standards, please.
So the AUASB's mandate would really apply to all of our pronouncements. So it would apply to the standard on related service engagements as well. And I guess that's where the Australian compelling reasons test really comes into play. So the Australian compelling reasons test is where the Australian board considers there to either be a legal or regulatory reason why we should divert and be different to the international standard, or where there are principles and practices in Australia that demonstrate, I'm going to use loose words, that demonstrate better practice. So upping the benchmark against the international standard. So could we effectively just take the international standard or should I rather say, could we effectively just keep the Australian standard? The answer to that question is yes. We'd need to go through a compelling reason test to keep the Australian standard in its entirety. What would be a more likely outcome is that we'd follow our mandate to adopt the international standard, but we would use the compelling reason test to modify that standard where deemed necessary for the Australian environment. So I hope that answers the question.
I hope it does as well. If there's any additional questions, please, or clarifications required, please submit them. Okay, so we've had a couple more questions come through now, and we might just take these last two and then we'll wrap them up. Okay, so Renee, this is a question about independence. Did the IAASB consider, independence from the point of view of what the market expectations are and what stakeholders are expecting? And would we expect there to be any amendments to the ethical code as a result of what's coming through the AUP standard?
So the International Board did consider this, and in fact, independence was a key topic of conversation at the IAASB and around the board, and it took them a long time and a lot of deliberation for them to land where they have landed, and they have landed where they are because of where the Code of Ethics is, quite frankly, and an AUP engagement is not an assurance engagement. And that is why they have landed where they are. Do we think that there'll be a change to the ethics code as a result of this? I'm not expecting there to be a change to the ethics code as a result of this. Worldwide, around the table, when the IAASB deliberated this, there really are differing views of the board. And it's one of these topics, I guess, that's landed in the exposure draft in one way, but they really do put the question out to stakeholders to give their feedback, because it's one of these other areas where they really are looking for feedback to ascertain where the world sits in relation to this matter. So where it will ultimately land, I don't know. It could well land where the Australian standard currently is.
Okay, right, let's change tact a little bit. So question is, would you use AUP ever when you're testing controls? Doesn't controls testing have a level of subjectivity, which means that you can't use AUP? What would be your view on that, Renee?
Well, my view on it is that you can do an AUP engagement on a control engagement. The procedures that you're undertaking when you set up the engagement are just very specific as to what you will be doing, and you stick with those procedures. So that's where the judgment comes into it. So you apply your judgment in setting up those procedures up front, but then you don't apply judgment in conducting the procedures. Hope that makes sense.
I think, yep, I hope that's fairly clear. Okay, another question about independence. How does the international standard expect a practitioner to assess independence, particularly when the Australian standard that we currently have is so clear in relation to the specific requirements that's in the ethical code, specifically in section 291?
Well, the international standard really comes from a perspective of you're either required, there's a presumption that you're not required to be independent. But there are some, let's say, a regulator requires you to be independent. And that's where the international standard puts a lot of detail into what gets reported in an AUP report in terms of independence, because there could be a requirement by a regulator that you are independent, and then you need to assess your independence and report against that.
Excellent. Okay, the next question is probably one that we can't answer, but I'll open it up just for your thoughts on the matter, and that is, would you say that the new proposals under the international standard mean that the standard is more commercial than the existing Australian standard because it'll allow more flexibility and maybe less rigidity than the Australian standard?
I think that where it certainly will be more practical from an Australian perspective is in relation to the upfront, when you get the buy-in from intended users. So the engaging partner or the auditor doesn't actually need to get sign-off by the intended users that the procedures will meet their objectives. So from a practical perspective, in that sense, I think it will help Australian stakeholders. The independence, if it were to land at a point, and the Australian Auditing Standards Board landed at a point that you don't need to be independent, it would widen, I guess, those that could be performing certain engagements. Other than those two areas, I don't think that you're going to see much of a difference in practice between what's being proposed in the international standard and how the Australian standard is currently operating.
Thanks, Renee. And I think that's a good place for us to wrap things up. 2 points I think that highlights is that, if you have questions or queries about issues around commerciality and challenges around independence, which seems to be where most of the questions are coming from, that's exactly the sort of feedback that the AUASB would be looking for in the context of the submissions on the consultation paper. And the other thing I think this is highlighted today is obviously the requirements around independence in APS 110 are governed by, in Australia, the APESB. So one of the takeaways for us today is, considering a lot of the questions that have happened, will be to reach out to the APESB and then get specific feedback from them in relation to these matters. I'm sure we're going to get that anyway, but we'll make sure that from the point of view of the consultation on this exposure draft, that we make sure that the APESB are heavily involved, and likewise, we'd welcome you to provide feedback to the APESB if you think it's relevant as well, if you think there are concerns. Certainly, as part of our planning and as we went through the AUP standard as to its development internationally, we certainly haven't been concerned around where the independence side of things has been going. But again, we welcome your feedback. Okay, Renee, I think we'll wrap things up now. What we need to do is get onto the final slide, which I can't do, so you'll have to go back. Renee's, everyone's going to have to go back to her room to change the slides. So we'll wrap things up. Questions in relation to today's webinar, or indeed any of the matters relating to the consultation paper, should be directed either directly to Renee as our subject matter expert, or you can log them via our standard email address, which is inquiries@auasb.gov.au. We'll wrap things up. Everyone, thank you very much for attending. We've had fantastic attendance today. Over 50 people have logged in, and we'll be sending out a feedback form, a little short survey to all the people who attended today. Particularly bearing in mind it's the first time we've done one of these webinars. We really would appreciate you taking a minute or two to fill in the questions and provide any feedback in relation to the way we run these webinars. So we'll wrap things up. Thank you very much for your time.